as you all know, our media does not give very good coverage on a lot of issues. And one of them, of course, is the Israeli-Palestine issue. So when I listened to Richard Silverstein a while back, I learned things I've never learned before. And so I think we're all going to be very, very fortunate and learn a lot tonight. I appreciate the fact he's given up his evening to speak to us, a rather small group, but I would like to welcome him, and thank you very much.
I want to thank Jeanette, your president, for inviting me to speak tonight, and I have spoken here before. Carl Pritchard, I think, invited me for a UN kind of forum that they had a couple of months ago. And I also belong to Congregation Beth Shalom, which is a neighbor to your church. So I'm very used to this. In fact, in this room, we have high holiday services with our kids sometimes. And I love looking at the Ben Shahn illustrations on the wall. And he's one of my artistic idols from going back to the 1960s. When Jeanette first asked me to speak, it was last summer, and it was in the middle of the war in Gaza. And she asked me to speak about Gaza, and I said, well, I don't really know what's going to be happening on October 23rd, but I'll speak about whatever is relevant on October 23rd. And it turns out that Gaza is still very relevant, unfortunately, because this summer brought us a terrible war, Operation Protective Edge, it was called by the Israelis. It ended with 2,100 Palestinians killed, 80% of whom were civilians. And somewhere a little over 50 Israelis were killed, and almost all of them were soldiers. I think there were 3 or 4 Israeli civilians that were killed. Today, the Operation Protective Edge was a bloodbath, the likes of which even this violent place hasn't seen for decades. Today, Gaza is in ruins, deliberately destroyed, mostly destroyed by the Israelis. I saw on the internet a drone's eye view of Gaza. They had the drone flying over very slowly, and you could just see everything right out in front of you, beneath the eye, the camera of the drone. And it looked to me, I don't know if anybody's seen pictures of Dresden after World War II or Hiroshima after the bomb was dropped. It looked pretty much like that. It just ruins everywhere. There are at least 18,000 families that are refugees in Gaza. And keep in mind, these are people who themselves were made refugees, their ancestors in 1948, when they were driven out. Most of the people in Gaza come originally from Israel, southern Israel mostly, and they were driven out once in the event that was called the Nakba by the Palestinians. And now many of them have been made refugees again. You may have heard also that there was a terrible incident in the Mediterranean where a boatload full of several hundred refugees, many of whom had left from Gaza because their homes were destroyed and they had nothing left in Gaza, and they desperately were trying to get to Europe and be, on that pipeline that goes through the Mediterranean. And their boat was rammed by the smugglers who were supposed to be smuggling them and deliberately sunk, and 300 people were drowned in that incident. That happened about a month ago. So these people have suffered immensely from the war. The world during the summer stood by idly and did almost nothing. Though the US, Turkey, Qatar offered to mediate between the Israelis and the Gazans, Israel distrusted all of them as being biased towards Hamas. It preferred the services of the Egyptian military junta, with which it has a very cozy relationship. About the best that we can say in terms of a positive outcome, and I put that in quotes, is that the massacre did leave a foul taste in the mouths of most of the world, and Israel's reputation sank even lower than it already was before. That, in turn, has enhanced the stature of the BDS movement, that's Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions movement. It's also enhanced the strength of the campaign by the Palestinians and in the United Nations for full recognition, for full statehood. That campaign is now kind of in a quiet phase, but the Palestinians have said that they at any moment might raise the issue in the United Nations. So we have the prospect of a full-scale battle for Palestinian statehood in the United Nations. And the fact that Israel started this war and turned it into such a bloodbath has, I think, strengthened the prospects for Palestinian recognition. The United States, the United Nations has seen many resolutions about Israel in the past couple of years in the Security Council, and the only two states that really have opposed recognition of Palestine are Israel, of course, and the United States. The other Security Council resolutions that we've supported Israel on, even though they contradict our own stated policy, were a resolution that denounced settlements and another resolution that called for statehood. We made known that we would veto such a resolution, and then it was not brought forward. So what do we have to show for supporting Israel? Not much, unfortunately. Even our own leaders, Barack Obama, John Kerry, Secretary of State, don't have any faith in the Israeli leadership. But due to the iron grip that the Israel lobby holds on our policy towards Israel and Palestine, we as Americans, not personally as Americans, but officially in terms of our government, are immobilized. We can't even be an honest broker between the two sides, which we would supposedly like to be. During Protective Edge, we were placed in the awkward role of a bystander. It reminded me of driving on the freeway past a fatal accident, and you feel a sense of horror and dread at what's happened, but you're helpless to intervene. That's the status that we had, basically, during the summer. The background to all this was the failure of the peace talks that John Kerry pursued for a year with Israel and Palestine, trying to get them to come up with some kind of an agreement. That failed. I was always skeptical that it would work because I never felt that Israel had the will to make the compromises that were needed. I didn't feel that the United States, that the president had the will to invest the kind of political capital that would be necessary to go against the Israel lobby to pressure Israel to come to such an agreement. Without that kind of power, without that kind of wind at Kerry's back, there just was no hope for him. He had nowhere to go, no maneuvering room in terms of bringing Israel to heel. Once those talks broke down, that set the stage for everything that came after. It set the stage for the war. It set the stage for all of the terrorism that has gone on, and I'm going to be talking about what happened yesterday in Jerusalem as part of that as well. Yesterday, there was a new page in the conflict, a heinous attack by a Palestinian who lives in a neighborhood of East Jerusalem called Silwan, drove his car onto the light rail tracks in Jerusalem at a train station in East Jerusalem as passengers were leaving the train as it came into the station. He deliberately drove on the tracks and struck as many people as he could, and he killed a 3-month-old baby. He injured 7 other people. This was in a neighborhood called Ammunition Hill, which is in occupied East Jerusalem. And I should also add that Hamas took credit for this attack, and it called the killing of the child a brave act. Needless to say, this, not just that statement, but the whole context of what I'm going to be talking about, both Israel and the Palestinians, I think this statement and this act displays some of the psychopathology that informs the whole conflict. And I'm going to be talking about that as it happens on both sides, not just on the Palestinian side. The loss of such a tender child's life is senseless. The mourning of the mother who is pushing her child's baby carriage rends our hearts. But we have to remember that this summer, 500 other Palestinian mothers lost their children as well. And the war that took those lives was as senseless, or more so even, than the act that happened at the light rail station yesterday. The Ammunition Hill attack is an example of what I call the chickens coming home to roost. And I mean by the chickens coming home to roost, I'm talking about a particular aspect of Israeli society that I call settlerism. That is the movement of the Israeli settlers for political power, to dominate the political discourse, to dominate Israel's relationship with the Palestinians, to dominate Israel's security policy, just really basically to dominate all of Israeli society, even though they're a minority. That famous expression of the chickens coming home to roost is from Malcolm X, obviously, and I mean it to evoke the fatal inevitability of violence and hate in this conflict. Bibi Netanyahu spoke a couple of weeks ago on, I think it was either Face the Nation or one of the Sunday political talk shows, and he defended the settlers' theft and expulsion of Palestinians from East Jerusalem, which is the neighborhoods where they're in the majority, in Silwan, the neighborhood where this terrorist came from. He defended the expulsions. He defended the theft of the homes of these Palestinians. That happens because of settlers coming in. They arrange for fraudulent real estate transactions. They claim that the Palestinians who own these homes in East Jerusalem have sold the homes. They usually sell them to a broker. The broker is working on behalf of settlers and behalf of NGOs, and I'll mention them in a second. The brokers are fraudulent. Everything about the transaction is fraudulent. But what isn't fraudulent is when the police come to the homes and evict the Palestinians, some of whom have been living in these homes for generations. So you have 20,000 Palestinians in Silwan, and you may only have 100, 200, 300 who've been evicted, but it's the beginning of a tidal wave of this sort of activity that the settlers are engaging in. Some of these NGOs, one of them is called Ateret Kohanim, and another is called Elad. These are companies, these are NGOs which have an ideology, sort of an Orthodox Jewish perspective, and by that I mean a kind of theocratic, settlerist kind of perspective on politics. They want to rebuild the Jewish temple that was destroyed by the Romans the last time it was destroyed. They want to rebuild the temple. They want to create high priests like there were in the old temple, and they want to restore sacrifices, and they want to do all sorts of interesting and strange things that most of us in the modern era don't understand and are opposed to even. And I know that many Jews are opposed to this as well, but it doesn't seem to matter what the majority wants, because the minority, in this case, when it has a very clear ideological goal and has control of the levers of power in Israel, it can pretty much do what it wants. I should say that Ateret Kohanim is a group that has a friends group in the United States. It raises lots of money for its work. And one of its fundraisers in the United States is the wife of a powerful Orthodox Jewish Democratic leader in New York, whose name is Dov Heikind. He was a former member, a leader of the Jewish Defense League. Now he's a very powerful political leader based in Brooklyn. And she, his wife, is their fundraiser. So there is a kind of malevolent network that bridges Israel and the United States in terms of these settlers getting much of their political and financial support from American Jews, from Orthodox right-wing American Jews in this country. And we're not talking about $1 million here. We're talking about over the past, say decade, of more than $100 million being transferred from the United States to support settlers in Israel. And all of that money is tax deductible. That means that the IRS is subsidizing settlers with American tax dollars. Not directly, obviously, but those people who are giving this money don't have to pay the taxes because they're making tax deductible donations. So we are basically subsidizing settlers, even though that completely contradicts U.S. policy, which is opposed to settlements. So go figure. Israel's, I call it the settlerist government. By that I mean the fact that Bibi Netanyahu, the prime minister, and the coalition, the ruling coalition that he runs, basically support this settlerist ideology that I've talked about. And basically what this is ethnic cleansing. They want to de-Arabize East Jerusalem to the extent that they can. They want to Judaize all of Jerusalem. Now, West Jerusalem is already Jewish, but East Jerusalem is largely Arab, Palestinian, and they would like eventually, just like in 1948, Israel expelled 1 million Palestinians during that war, they would like to expel as many Palestinians as they can from East Jerusalem and get to rebuild its temple. Now, what will happen if the temple is rebuilt, which is theoretical right now, but where would the temple be built? It would be built on the Temple Mount. What is on the Temple Mount right now? The Dome of the Rock. What would happen to the Dome of the Rock? Gone. So you can see we've got a train wreck coming if these people take over. And if the temple is rebuilt, if the Dome of the Rock is destroyed, you can see a holy war coming. Now, we've seen the beginning footsteps of that, the sort of creeping footsteps of that, because last week, some of you may have seen, or if you haven't, I'm going to tell you, a terribly distressing video of the worshipers inside Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is one of the two major mosques on the Temple Mount. First, settlers coming to lay claim to the Temple Mount by praying there. And you can imagine on a Muslim sacred site to have Jews praying in Jewish ritual, it's threatening to them. So there were demonstrations, and as a result of those demonstrations, the Muslim worshippers entered Al-Aqsa and tried to lock it, and the police came and they fired tear gas canisters into the mosque. So you had these explosions going off, and you could see in the video, like the fire from the exploding tear gas canisters. You could see the plumes of smoke, the people running. I mean, it's just unfathomable to me. I mean, imagine this happening in our places of worship here in the United States. It's just astonishing that this would happen, but it is happening. And so there may be some people who say, oh, this is kind of alarmist. Nobody's really talking about destroying the Dome of the Rock. Nobody's talking about rebuilding the temple. Yeah, you can say that, but where does it start? It's got to start somewhere, and it's starting. So I think that we have to be very, very, very concerned about where this could lead. So no one is defending the rights of these Palestinians to stay in their homes. So if a deranged or extremist Palestinian comes into the midst of this political vacuum, who is to blame, aside from the perpetrators, militants themselves who've done this killing? Of course, they're to blame. But they aren't the ones who really have the power to determine what happens. It's the leaders that have the power. And if they don't choose to use the power, then they've made a choice. And so people like Obama, Kerry, the European Union, these are all forces that have power that could be brought to bear to make this situation different. And they choose not to use the power. There are lots of reasons, we can talk about that, why it doesn't happen, because it would take an enormous force of will to go against the lobby, to go against the opposition that Israel would bring to bear if there was pressure put. But they still choose to do nothing. So yesterday in Israel's leading liberal paper, Haaretz, they talked about all of this activity in Jerusalem as being the Jerusalem Intifada. The Intifada refers to the first and second Intifadas, which were organized mass resistance by the Palestinians against the occupation. So now what we have in Jerusalem is mounting terror, violence, murders, kidnappings, terror attacks happening on both sides. There were three, during the summer, this was what started Operation Protective Edge, three Israeli teenagers were kidnapped and murdered in the West Bank. I think it was West Bank, it might have been Israel, I can't remember. And as a result of the murder, a couple of insane settlers kidnapped a Palestinian boy and killed him in a terribly gruesome way. And all of that led to what I call a pogrom on the West Bank. Israel sent 10,000 soldiers into the West Bank. They arrested 500 people. They killed 7 Palestinians who demonstrated against them. They ransacked thousands of homes. As a result of that, Hamas started to fire rockets in protest into Israel. The rockets didn't kill anyone, but Israel in retaliation invaded. And that's how we got the mess that was last summer. So settlers under the leadership of the deputy speaker of the Knesset, whose name is Moshe Feiglin, one of these people I was telling you about who believes in the divine sort of, divine approval, divine blessing that he and his movement have received to do these things in Jerusalem. They swarmed, he and his followers swarmed the Temple Mount, and that was the prelude to what I had just been talking about, the riots that happened on the Temple Mount. So what is a Palestinian to think when they see Israeli police blasting tear gas into the Temple Mount, when they see settlers kidnapping 13-year-old boys and lighting them on fire, when they see their own neighbors evicted from their homes by Israeli police with official sanction for it? What is a Palestinian to think? Can they think that the Jews have their interests at heart? Can they think that they will accommodate them in any way? In reality, this has become a zero-sum game. There's no way any longer for both sides to win. In a normal conventional situation, you look for a compromise if two people or two parties are at loggerheads, and you try to give something to each side, and you take away something from each side, or each side gives up something, and you reach some kind of middle ground. That's increasingly become impossible. Most people in Israel and Palestine see it as either they win or we win. And we can't allow them to win. We have to win. We are willing to sacrifice everything for us to win. And you can imagine, based on what I've been telling you, what everything means. It means everything. It means their lives. It means their neighborhoods. We could be talking about a holy war, religious war between both sides. I'm going to talk a little bit later about the slim hope that I have for what could rectify the situation, what could be constructive outcome, but the only one that I see is the world demanding from both sides to end it and imposing a settlement on both sides. That would be an extremely difficult thing to bring to bear because the world is, as I've said, comatose, asleep. when it comes to moral issues like this. Look how long it took for them to intervene in Kosovo or in Serbia or in Rwanda, and look what it took in terms of suffering and victims for that to happen. That hasn't yet happened in this conflict, and it may yet happen, I'm sorry to say. So this is a recipe for an apocalyptic conflict, a religious war with blood flowing freely. And during the summer, during Protective Edge, we had one of the division commanders, whose name was Colonel Winter, leading one of the main brigades in the Israeli army that fought a lot of the grunt sort of ground war there. He invoked the Bible and said that our forces have God's blessing and we are going to fight against, now, if you know the geography at all, Gaza, the southernmost part of Israel is a place called Ashkelon. And Ashkelon in the Bible was the place where Samson brought down the Philistine temple. So the religious, the sort of true believers in Israel, said that this was a war against the Philistines. The Gazans became the Philistines, and Israel was Samson, although they forgot that in the story Samson ended up dying. But he took the Philistines with him and destroyed the temple and was triumphant. So this colonel used that to rally the troops and said, we are going into Gaza with God's blessing. We go forward, march forward. What is that saying that they have in 19th century in America about the, I can't remember what it is, but well, something like that. But you get the gist of what I'm saying. So I think that this kind of rhetoric should make everybody have a sense of foreboding. Wars that have political origins can be solved. As I said, one side gives up something, the other side gives up something. Both sides will get something that they find critical and need to have. But when you invoke the divine, when the cause becomes sacred, then you have a holy war, and then all bets are off. Unfortunately, there are those who should know better, who should be able to stop this. Obama, Kerry, and the others instead are trying benign neglect. You may remember that concept. It was created by Daniel Patrick Moynihan in the 1960s when he worked in the Nixon administration. It was his way of saying what Nixon should do with the ghetto in the United States. Benign neglect. Just lay off. Let everything just simmer at a low boil. That doesn't work in the Middle East. You let things simmer at a low boil, and you have bombs and explosions, and the radicals, the people who have nothing to lose, take over on both sides, I should say. There are these kinds of insane, extreme people on both sides, the Israeli side and the Palestinian side. So the Israeli Prime Minister's response to the terror attack yesterday was to say, basically, without using these words, I'm going to militarize East Jerusalem. I'm going to put so many, excuse my language, I'm going to put so many damn police on the streets of East Jerusalem that the residents there won't be able to sneeze without sneezing into the face of one of our policemen. And Israel has a force called the Border Police. And it's a combination of what used to be the INS here and the FBI. And they're particularly brutal. They're stationed in places where Israel feels it needs muscle and it needs to show force and show dominance. The border police are not afraid of beating people up, killing them sometimes, and using whatever form of violence is necessary to suppress resistance. So he's going to put the border police into East Jerusalem, and he's going to pacify East Jerusalem, right? Well, not so fast, because the Palestinians have a say in this. And the Palestinians don't care how brutal the border police are, because brutality and violence can only go so far in terms of bringing pacification. If the native population is unwilling and continues to resist, the violence has to be greater to suppress the resistance, and then it just becomes this crazy spiral that just ends up exploding at some point. So I want to talk about the light rail line, which is very important, even though you wouldn't think in the context of American life that a light rail line would be important. It's especially important in Jerusalem, because before the light rail, there was no infrastructure that united the whole city. I mean, you could drive in a car and you could go from East Jerusalem to West Jerusalem, but there was no form of public transportation that would unite everybody. So the light rail was a very interesting concept that the city created to do that. You've maybe all heard the slogan from Israelis that Jerusalem is united, eternally, the eternal united city. But Jerusalem was never united. It was always two separate parts. I mean, there were, if you wanted to go further, each neighborhood was kind of also autonomous in some ways, but especially East and West Jerusalem because of Arabs and Jews. This was a vision of transcending that division between the two, between Arab and Jew. There's a problem, though. They never bothered to get the acceptance of the Palestinian population. The Palestinians are saying, what is this city that they want to join us to? What is our investment in this city? What rights do we have in this city? What benefits are we going to get from this? Nothing. The Palestinians in East Jerusalem have no city services. They're not even citizens because they reject the idea of they've been offered citizenship. They reject that idea because they want to be part of Palestine, not part of Israel. So the result of this is the Palestinians have trashed the light rail line. This beautiful, gleaming, modern, infrastructure with beautiful stations and, just like Paris, any European city. They've trashed the lines. They've burned them. They've destroyed the track. They've vandalized everything. They've, done everything possible. They've pulled down the wires, electrical wires that allow the trains to run because they want to show resistance to it. And to Israelis, they don't understand. They think, these crazy people. This light rail line is progress. It's improvement. It's making our lives better, easier. And so they can see the Palestinians as the ones who are throwing throwing a wrench into Israeli society, standing in the way of progress. And you can see how this narrative of conflict, of contradiction develops between the two sides. Because from the Israeli point of view, these people are crazy. From the Palestinian point of view, the Jews are nuts themselves because they aren't taking into account Palestinian needs or interests in what they're doing in any way. So Palestinians in East Jerusalem are marginalized. And Israeli Palestinians in all of Israel are marginalized. They're second-class citizens. But it's even worse for Palestinians in East Jerusalem because they're not citizens. They don't vote. They don't get any services. Now, Israeli Palestinians in the rest of Israel get very few services either as well, but in East Jerusalem it's even worse. So this train line becomes, for the Palestinians, a way for Israeli Jews to advance their interests. And as far as Palestinians are concerned, this is a deadly formula. So I want to make clear in what I've said, and I think it's clear already, but when I write posts in my blog, I am showered with lots of static and opposition, and people will listen to a speech like this or read a blog post like this, and they will say, you support terrorism because you tried to say that there's a reason why this terrorist did what he did in Ammunition Hill. You're trying to explain the murder of a baby. And so by doing that, you're really saying that it's okay. You're trying to explain why the Palestinians do these things. And that means that you justify terror. I want to be very clear that that's not what I'm saying. I think everybody understands that, but there are a lot of people in the world who don't. I think that what I'm saying is an admission of reality. If Israeli Druze weren't stealing Palestinian land, if Israel accepted a compromise peace agreement, if the world cared about what happened to Palestinians, then they wouldn't need to resort to terrorism. As long as Israel can invade its frontline neighboring states like Lebanon, Gaza, even Syria to an extent where Israel has attacked over the past year in the midst of the civil war, with impunity and kill Palestinians, Lebanese, and even Syrians in the thousands, terrorism will fester. And let's not forget that Palestinian terrorism doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's a little controversial, but I've said that Operation Protective Edge, in effect, is state-sponsored terrorism. This was not a war where two armies were fighting each other on a battlefield and one beat the other. This is a war, this was a guerrilla war in which Israel invaded Gaza, which is not Israel, not Israeli territory. Israel is not sovereign in Gaza. So they invaded, in effect, another country, even though it's not technically a nation. But they invaded Palestine. And they did so to force the Palestinians to bend to their will. They used war as a policy, as a political, to achieve their political objectives. What they did basically was eradicate Gaza. And what is that if not terrorism? You had 80% of these 2,100 who died in Gaza were civilians. 500 were children. To me, that's terrorism. There were no military objectives. There were no military bases. There were no airfields. There were no, there was no armored corps that Israel attacked. They were attacking people. They were attacking civilians. They were attacking the UN schools where scores and scores of Palestinian civilians, families, children died who were taking shelter in these schools. So if we want to talk about Palestinian terrorism, we also have to talk about terrorism on the other side. So in closing, I want to say that if Israel were smart, it would recognize Palestine. Israel claims that it supports a two-state solution, although that's really window dressing. It doesn't. And most of its senior leaders don't support a two-state solution. But if it really did support one, it would recognize Palestine immediately. It would withdraw from the West Bank. It would agree to return to 67 borders. And it would tell the Palestinians, you know what? We're going to give you responsibility. It's your country. We give you responsibility. That means if you have people who want to engage in terror acts, we expect you to take care of them and police them. And if you don't, then we'll have to do it. Or if you don't, we'll bring in an international force. There is now a UN force in Lebanon that separates Hezbollah and Israel. There was a force in Syria that separated the Syrians and the Israelis, which left because the Syrian rebels kidnapped the UN peacekeepers. But that could happen, the peacekeeping force could be put in place separating Israel and Palestine. So there are many, many ways that a peace agreement could guarantee the security of both sides. Israel has refused that option. It doesn't want its sovereignty to be questioned in terms of having international forces on its territory. So it's refused. So, the problem for us, I think, as outsiders is not to try to understand or accept Israel refusing. It's to say, no, your refusal makes no sense. And we're not going to, as members of the international community, we're not going to stand by. We're not going to stand for it. It means that we have to get our president to get a backbone and be willing to stand up to the lobby. And that is really where the biggest problem is. So I think that now, until we get that outcome where the international community is willing to intervene, the Palestinians feel emasculated and they feel powerless in the face of overwhelming Israeli power. And powerlessness does not read responsibility. Remember, I just said that Israel should say to the Palestinians, it's yours. You own it. You take it over. You control it. You have the responsibility. But Israel isn't willing to do that, so Israel has no right to expect that the Palestinians will help them in any way. But if they saw things differently, if they were more foresighted, if they were more pragmatic, they would realize that Palestinian independence really can work in their interest. And I'm afraid that that can't happen until the world decides it has to do something. I shudder to think what has to happen before the world wakes out of this moral slumber. But that's the only possibility, because Israel cannot do this itself. It doesn't want to do it itself. It's not willing to make the compromises. There are no political leaders, no political parties in Israel that have any prospect of running a country that would have this kind of foresight and would be willing to make these kinds of compromises. So it leaves the world outside. And that's why, as I said earlier, BDS is so hopeful. I mean, in years past, many of us thought BDS is kind of marginal. You know, it's such a kind of out there concept, boycotting Israel. You know, we boycotted South Africa, but it didn't seem to some of us that Israel was quite at that stage. And now it's come to the point where, yes, things are that bad, and BDS seems like a viable alternative, because things have become so bad that even the things before that seemed outlier ideas have become mainstream. And that's really how bad the situation is. And I'm sorry to end on such a down note, but I think that the fact that we care about this situation and that you've come to hear the talk is the hopeful thing that we can take out of tonight. And I'd be happy to answer any questions that anybody might have.
Yeah, I have two things that actually are related. The Israeli lobby really isn't all Jewish. Can you talk about the makeup of that?
Yeah.
And number two, you talk about the benign neglect of the Western world. How about the Arab world too?
Mm-hmm.
The Arab leadership that really has done nothing
Yeah.
except make the situation worse.
Yeah, yeah. So the Israel lobby, this term comes from the early 1950s, right after the state was founded. Jews outside of Israel decided we were going to start lobbying for Israel, because Israel was a small, vulnerable state, and they felt that since Israel had always gotten a lot of support from the diaspora, that they should organize this support and create a lobby. They didn't call it a lobby, but the little organization that was created in Washington in 1952 eventually became AIPAC. Started out, a small office with one guy and one secretary and a couple of people supporting him around the country, and eventually it turned into AIPAC, $60 million annual budget, 4,000 people attending their annual conventions in Washington, and lobbying done in every congressional district in the country, basically stymieing any initiative that isn't sanctioned by Israel or by the lobby. But it's not just Jews. It is largely Jewish, but it's not just Jews. It's Christian evangelicals, it's John Hagee, it's the Christians United for Israel. It's really a lot of evangelical congregations where they go in and they fundraise. And I was talking to you about fundraising for Ateret Kohanim from Orthodox and right-wing American Jews. The Christian evangelical community sends millions and millions of dollars to Israel every year as well. And they have some evangelicals who are serving in the Israeli army. They have some evangelicals who are settling in settlements on the West Bank. So for these kind of people, the Christian evangelicals who are interested in the second coming, the ending of the world, is sort of apocalyptic Armageddon kind of theology. Israel is like the testing ground for them, because if we bring the Jews back and have the ingathering of the exiles, those of you who know your Old Testament or maybe your New Testament, the ingathering of the exiles, all the Jews come back to Israel. That enables there to be this final battle between Gog and Magog, and most of the Jews are killed, and then there's this this little remnant of Jews that are left. They convert to Christianity, and you all know how that ends. This is in their mind. But it drives, people have crazy notions, but when the crazy notions start driving history and creating facts on the ground, that's when things get very dangerous. I don't care if people have delusional ideas, as long as they don't act on them. When they act on the delusional ideas, that's when you get terror attacks in East Jerusalem. That's when you get, all the horrors that we've been talking about. So yes, there's a very strong Christian element to the Israel lobby. And, they say that 40% of American Christians are evangelicals, so you can imagine how many people that is. That's a huge number of Christians supporting Israel, supporting right-wing settlerist Israel. I mean, I see myself as somebody who supports Israel, but I define that support and I define my vision of Israel much differently than those people. There's really a battle between who really has Israel's best interests at heart. And even though much of what I say is controversial in a lot of circles in the American Jewish community, I want American Jews to understand that I have the best interests of Israel at heart in what I'm doing, because I think disaster is in store if you go their way. Whereas there's compromise and the possibility of hope and of both sides living together if you go, a different way. One other thing I should say before I take another question is, I haven't mentioned that I have a blog. It's called Tikkun Olam. The link or the URL for it is my name, which is richardsilverstein.com. I'd love for you to take a look. I write almost every day about something going on in Israel, and sometimes the issues include the United States, and sometimes they include other issues like Muslim-Jewish relations and Christian-Jewish relations as well. So let's take another question. Yeah.
I certainly find your presentation, I feel like there's so much truth to it. But I do not think, and I feel very strongly that we should not go in to support or try and help sort the situation out. Because we really tried to do that for a long, long time. I mean, how many times is? And I think that it needs to be a political decision on both parts. I don't think either one of those groups are willing to make the kinds of
Compromise.
right
Yeah.
that they're going to do. We do give them $50 billion a year, and they pay it back to us by buying weapons for us. I think we should cut that off. I think that's would be good. I think BDS would be very good too.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think I don't think it's our mess. We have our own messes, and we need to clean them up, and I don't think we belong there. Because we don't have the wisdom to do it. We don't understand it well enough.
Yeah.
And another thing, in 67 and 72, which I know you know about, they were attacked on all sides by every Arab country. And the lands that they got because they were attacked, and they had to take that. I mean, they are people that have been threatened.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the things they do are because they feel threatened. Do you see any political group that could perhaps bring them to some kind of better? I mean, Netanyahu won't, but there are other people in Israel who perhaps would make them better. What they need is leadership.
So the question, really more of a statement, was that
statement?
That's okay. That's okay. Statements are allowed.
I'll add to it. I was in Israel for 3.5 weeks this summer. I fell in love with Israel, and I fell in love with the Israelis. Now, they were presenting something to me that is only one side.
Right.
It's
right.
like America has so many sides. We
Right.
have so many
Right.
sides to us
Right.
too.
Right.
We have wonderful sides, and our ingenuity and the brains and their culture And the fact that they rose out of socialism and such wonderful ideals, I mean, they are wonderful, wonderful people.
So the question was, the point of view of the commenter, what the questioner was, that the United States should stand back from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and should not take an active role because we don't have the wisdom and we don't know how to do it right, basically. And I agree to a point with what you said. I think that generally the United States has mucked around in the Middle East and messed up almost everything we've touched. Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, you name it, and we've messed up. Lebanon, they had the Marine barracks bombing in 82 or whenever that was. So it's true. We think we mean the best, and we are willing to go into places, and we're like a bull in a china shop when we do it. But what I have in mind is not this kind of conventional way that America goes into other countries where we send the Marines in and we invade or we occupy or we do something that's military in nature. I have in mind, if it ever were to happen, that it would be an agreement, it would be an alliance between lots of different nations, not just the United States. It wouldn't be a unilateral approach. It would be a lot of the European Union, it would be the United States, it would be other countries coming together either in the UN or the Security Council or through NATO and saying, this is what our solution is, and this is what you're going to do. Now, you have every right not to agree to do what we're telling you to do, but if you don't agree, we're going to put you in a vice. We're going to put sanctions on you, slap sanctions on you, and you won't be able to wriggle out of this. That's the way you have to deal with it, and you need kind of agreement and consensus from the outside on what will happen. And Israel, despite all this huge level of pride and machismo that goes along with Israelis, basically will have no choice, I think. So let's take another question. Way in the back, a man in suspenders.
I agree with a lot of things you're saying. I think your solution is radically simplistic and willing to demonstrate it's illogical in your own terms. But first of all, I want to bit of background. I spent 12 years in Israel from before 67 through 2 wars. And then the Israeli army patrolled refugee camps in the Gaza Strip. It's as bad as you make it out to be. I have no disagreement with you on the settler movement. But it was a strange place before 67. I lived in a place where the country was so narrow that when Hussein wanted to fire his artillery into Tel Aviv, it went over where I lived, and if you didn't aim right, it went into the water. No, literally, the width of the country was less than the range of old artillery, not new artillery. So it's a very insecure place. Here's your logical argument. That the moral code in the United States and the rest of the world and Europe, which has never been demonstrated to be very good to start with, is going to unite, and they're going to do justice in the Middle East. Why the hell should any Jew trust the moral code of Europe? I had one time, I taught at PLU down in Tacoma. Somebody asked me to talk about the very same subject in a political science class. And believe me, I don't have much use for the settlers. And I wish to hell they could have a two-state solution, because the articles I'm reading from Israel suggest that it may be too late. And if it's too late, then the choice for Israel, and Ben Gurion saw this a long time ago, either it isn't a Jewish state, or it isn't a democratic state.
Right.
Because if it's gonna be democratic and there's one state, then everybody votes. And if everybody votes, it's not a Jewish state. And if it is gonna be a Jewish state and they don't divide it up, then it's gotta be an apartheid state.
Right,
And they knew that a long time ago.
right.
But the students didn't quite understand the Israeli position. So I put it this way, that let's assume that Richard's argument is taken. And there's a good way to do that. All the Arab states would have to do if they really like the Palestinians, which they never have, is threaten oil. Get the Russians to go along, Europe, either you solve this problem for us or you run out of oil. And then I looked at the class and I said, if I was in charge of things in Israel, and that were to happen, I wouldn't aim the rockets with the nuclear bombs, the Arab capitals. I would prefer Berlin, Paris, and London. For a simple reason. We already paid our dues to the Europeans. We don't have to do it again. You brought up Samson. Menachem Begin, he would get up and say, you know, Masada is not going to happen again. But I think in Israel, it would be Samson. Mot nafshi im plishti. The translation, let my soul go with the Philistines. Take them all out.
Mm-hmm.
No, seriously.
Mm-hmm.
The level of insecurity in
Yeah.
Israel is enormous.
Yeah.
They have never trusted Europe.
Right.
They have never really trusted the United States, even though in the 73 war there was incredible help. But what did Truman do in 48? He had an embargo. You know, he did BDS in 48.
Mm-hmm.
It almost worked.
Mm-hmm.
Why on earth should, of all places on earth, the Israelis begin to believe in the moral code of the United States and Europe? I mean, Germany too, of course.
Yeah.
You've got to add them into Europe. So, I think your argument is simplistic. I don't think the logic is there. Having said that, I'm a little bit hopeful. And I'm really hopeful because finally I'm seeing signs of everybody being pretty tired on both sides. Being tired. The military were against the operation in Gaza. Most of the military said it was useless. The military have been telling the government for years there's no military solution. And then, of course, being is a political thing. Netanyahu substituting all the leadership in the military with religious people now.
Right.
So he can
right.
get a better opinion.
Right. Okay, so let me, it's really hard for me to summarize that statement, but basically that gentleman was saying that why should the Israelis trust the outside world, because the outside world has always let down the Jews, and I think there was the shadow of the Holocaust in what you were talking about, and you know, we should talk about that probably.
Far away from the mind.
Never far away from any Israelis or any Jew's mind, of course. And I understand that motivation, and I understand the role that plays in the Israeli psyche. The Holocaust and the death of 6 million, the murder of 6 million Jews is always in their minds. And if it isn't in their minds in a legitimate way, it's in the minds of politicians in an illegitimate way, in terms of trying to manipulate and exploit the fears of the Holocaust. And say, for example, Shimon Peres called an Iranian nuclear weapon a flying Holocaust. So there are all sorts of ways in which Israeli politicians invoke the Holocaust. Just like in the United States, we have our politicians invoke these crazy wedge issues and ideas in voters' minds, the fears that are floating, this free-floating anxiety that lots of people have, whether it's Ebola or immigrants or whatever. So they invoke that to try to gain some advantage. What the Israelis? Oh, no, I'm not saying it's... No, I'm not saying, let me be clear, I'm not saying the Holocaust is a fantasy, and I'm not saying the trauma of the Holocaust is a fantasy. But I am saying that the Holocaust subsumes everything in the Israeli context. An Israeli cannot go and face any issue, whether it's an issue facing them in the present or an issue facing them in the future, without having that kind of dark shadow of the Holocaust. Let me. Okay. I understand completely your point of view, and I'm going to address it. But you can be immobilized by the past. You can be so traumatized by the past that you cannot face the future. Or if you're making a decision about what to do in the present or the future, you can make the wrong decision because you think that everything that is going to happen to you is going to be the same thing that happened to you during the Holocaust. So every person becomes a potential enemy. Every person becomes a potential murderer or exterminator or genocider. And that immobilizes, that traumatizes you, so you can't actually come up with a sane, reasonable view of reality or what your possibilities, what your choices are as a nation. So what I'm saying is the Holocaust is a very important historical event. And, I have published an oral history of a Holocaust survivor, an Auschwitz survivor. I know what the situation was like for survivors and for those who perished. So I'm not downplaying that at all. But I am saying that if the only thing that is in the mind of Israelis is the Holocaust and that it could happen again, they're going to make some terrible decisions. Wait, you spoke. You spoke. I'm still addressing what you had to say. So let's talk about. You spoke too. So if I want to take other people, I'm gonna let other people ask questions later. But since you already spoke, both of you, you're gonna have to let me speak because I was invited here to do that. So that's an important issue about trust. Israelis don't trust. They don't even trust themselves, let alone outsiders. So, and it is true, the world let the Jewish people down in 1939 and during World War II. Roosevelt could have taken action, and he didn't. Could have bombed the railroad lines to Auschwitz, and he didn't. He had other priorities. 6 million did die, and it was an enormous stain, a blemish on humanity that this happened. But we have to look at what happened, why it happened, what wasn't done, what could have been done. And we also have to admit that the world is not the same. It's a different place. We didn't have a United Nations in 1939. Now, lots of Israelis hate the United Nations, and they say it's out for no good, it's out to hurt Israel's interests. I don't believe that. We have a United Nations and some international bodies which have been able to take. They've acted slowly, they've acted too late in dealing with other forms of genocide in Rwanda and in Kosovo and in other places, but they have acted. So I don't know what it will take for the world to act, because it took 800,000 Rwandans dying before the world intervened in Rwanda. It took 250,000 people dying in the former Yugoslavia before the world intervened. I hope it's not going to take that many. There have only been 20,000 Palestinians who have been killed since 1948. I hope that we're not going to have to see a situation where there's 50,000 or 100,000 Palestinians killed before the world intervenes in this. But I think that the world has mechanisms in place that they did not have in place to stop Hitler that could be used to stop this, because 6 million died in the Holocaust. They stopped Rwanda with only 800. I'm sorry to use that term, but you know what I mean. It could have been worse. Serbia and Kosovo, the situation could have been worse. I pray that we will come to our senses. Now, one other thing I disagree with you about is that Israel does not have the capacity to do anything to address this. Politically, it's impossible. As I said, no political parties are willing to take the risk. There are some brave NGOs in Israel, that are human rights NGOs, that are fighting the good fight. I commend them for what they're doing. I don't at all dismiss the bravery and the courage that it takes to be an Israeli dissident and to fight against this powerful settlerist philosophy that's in place. But it's not enough. It's just not enough. Israel isn't a democracy.
Excuse me, I'm going to stop you.
No, you're not going to stop me. I think the audience is going to have to do something to deal with
You are the
her.
chairperson. This speaker has been speaking now for almost an hour and a half. That never happens. We always have extended discussion. You have been talking for an hour and a half, and you are not permitting discussion. That is really
What you're saying is absolutely false. I've been taking questions, and I'm going to take more questions. I took a question from that gentleman, I took a question from that gentleman, and if you would sit down and let me speak, then I didn't like your question. No, that's not true. It's not true that I didn't like your question. I answered your question. You didn't like the answer, so you need to sit down. And if she doesn't sit down, I think everybody else in the audience should ask her to sit down. Yes, please, would you ask a question? There's a woman who would like to ask a question. Let's ignore that interruption. Go ahead.
When you said the recent conflict in Gaza, you did not mention that, of course, Hamas was putting, bombing Israel. It was actually threatened.
I did mention that, but if you want me to go into it, I can. Yeah. Do you want me to talk more about that?
Well, I mean, that was always in the press, that it's always
Yeah.
been an excuse
Yeah.
for Israel to
Yeah.
do what it did.
Yes, good point. So what she has asked is that we talk a little bit about Hamas and about the actions of Hamas that have played a role in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the conflict between Israel and Gaza. And yes, I think it's important to note that the Palestinians have attempted to, we've talked about terrorism tonight, and the Palestinians have attempted to use various forms of violent resistance to Israel because of the occupation. And one of the forms that has taken is rockets. They're called Qassam rockets that they fire from Gaza into southern Israel. And those rockets have succeeded in terrorizing southern Israel. They've sent 1 million Israelis into shelters. And it's very inconvenient for Israelis, and it's frightening, and they hear air raid sirens all the time, and they have to run to their air raid shelters to take cover. And it's frightening for children, for Israeli children. And these are things that the Israelis use to talk about the suffering that they are faced with by Hamas. But the truth of the matter is, and I should say the rockets are used also by the Israeli government as a reason to retaliate, and that's what led to Operation Protective Edge. So once the IDF, the 10,000 troops, went into the West Bank, and the pogroms happened there that I talked about, Hamas responded to that invasion of the West Bank by launching several hundred rockets at southern Israel. There were very few injuries from the rockets of Hamas. These are rockets that are so primitive they can barely be guided. They just basically launch them in the air, and they point them in a certain direction, and they hope they'll land, where they'll do some damage. They almost never do. I think in this war, 3 Israeli civilians were killed by rockets. And in the course of the last decade, I think maybe 40 Israelis have been killed by these rockets. So yes, they're a form of terror, and I don't condone them. I don't support any form of violence against civilians on either side. But I think we have to see in context that there is, what Malcolm X said, resistance by all means necessary. So when you are resisting oppression, when you're resisting occupation, you're going to use whatever form you have at hand. And if you don't have political power and the other side doesn't want to negotiate and doesn't want to listen, and the other side has the 5th or 10th largest, most powerful army in the world, what kind of response are you going to be able to muster? So again, And nobody likes these forms of violence, but Israel has an army, Israel has pinpoint rockets, cruise missiles, Apache helicopter gunships, F-16s, you name it, and WMDs. They have 200 nuclear weapons. So what do the Palestinians, have? They use what they have at hand. The gentleman next to the woman who just asked the question with the glasses.
I just assume that the majority of us here, if not all of us, are interested in finding a solution, a just solution to it. And perhaps I would like to just direct the question to the gentleman here. It was told that your solution perhaps is simplistic, which, of course, everybody is entitled to, to shape it or to form it as we like. What do you think? So what I would like to ask you, because you are interested in this, what do you think would be the proper solution? Or how can we solve it? Because really this is the interest of all of us, should be. It's a problem and we are all interested in finding a just solution. So if this is simplistic, what do you think your solution is?
It's not just. This is a tribal war. And the essence of a tribal war is there's no room for you, both sides. You've got to go. It's a tribal war. Now it has religious colorations to it. It's basically a tribal war. And the belief in the Old Testament was you got rid of the other tribe. You literally destroyed them. Here's the problem of justice. There's an Israeli author who one time wrote that the one thing that can't solve a problem is justice. And the reason is that what justice is for the Palestinians, essentially, the elimination of Israel. And what justice is for the Israelis is the elimination of the Palestinians. So there's no just solution.
So should we leave it, like that, and
No,
one side? Destroy the other, or what? What should we do?
Because,
I have a
Israel
question.
can't destroy them
Yeah.
because they can win battles, but they can't win war.
I want to hear Mr. Silverstein comment on that.
I have a
Okay.
question.
Let's take another question and I'll try to.
Not really a question, but I think the question was asked, what other solutions would you see? So let's get to that.
Yeah, I do want to comment on that gentleman's statement that the Palestinians, or let's just say some Israelis view the Palestinians as wanting to destroy the state of Israel, as wanting to eliminate Jews from Israel or from the Middle East, whatever. And some Palestinians see the Israeli Jews as wanting to eliminate the Palestinians. And the truth of the matter is that in 1948, they did expel 1 million Palestinians from Israel. So there is some kind of...
Well, they tried to destroy Israel.
But I know, this kind of subject has so much passion. I really understand everybody sort of wanting their perspective to be heard, and kind of some people kind of jump out of their skin over it because it's so emotional, and that's why I'm involved with the issue myself. But we have to kind of figure out how to express ourselves and then let other people speak. And I know that's really hard because if the other person doesn't say what you want to hear, then you've got to say something, in response. So I completely understand this and also appreciate the kind of, desire to have some civility. Yeah. So you have two options here. Oh, getting back to that. I don't think that because some people on each side see the other as maximalist and rejectionist and exterminationist. So if the Palestinians see Israelis as figures who want to eliminate Palestinians, and the Israelis see the Palestinians as those who want to eliminate Jews, that doesn't mean that that's true. That means that that's the bogeyman that they've got in their head. That's again this kind of Holocaust trauma kind of syndrome that people have, and That's one of the reasons why I think it's almost impossible to get them by themselves to come up with a solution. It's been tried so many times, and it just hasn't worked. The Israelis are not willing to make the compromises. I think the Palestinians are basically willing. They've, you can look at polls of Palestinians and look at their attitudes. They've been willing to accept the two-state solution. It's, they've been like the bride waiting at the altar, and there's been no groom. So they've seen, well, I'm not going to sit and wait at the altar forever. I'm going to try something else. So yes, we've tried the two-state solution. I was an advocate of the two-state solution. I was a liberal Zionist at one time. As you said, I mean, even though you've disagreed with some of the things I've said, even you, I think, recognize that the two-state solution may not be possible anymore. And it's a tragedy if it's not possible, because it means there's going to be a one-state solution. But there was an intimation in something that you said that I don't agree with, and you may not have meant it. So if you didn't, I'm just going to tell you my point of view. I don't think that I or we should tell the Israelis and the Palestinians what their future should be. I don't think we should tell them, we're going to oppose a two-state solution on you. We're going to oppose a one-state solution on you. I think that they have to figure that out themselves. So I don't think that a one-state solution means the end of Israel. I don't think it does mean one thing. It does mean the end of the concept of a Jewish state, in the sense that Jews would have superior values to non-Jews in that state. That's something that I used to think was very important, that the Jews be a majority, that the Jews demographically, be the majority, that Jews have certain rights that might not be accorded to others in Israel. I've come around to this view, and you noted it, that the conflict is between a Jewish state and a democratic state. You hit the nail on the head completely. I think that we have to have a democratic state. It does have to be a democratic state that respects the religious rights of all the religions in Israel. And there are Christians in Israel too. There are Druze, there are Bedouin, there are other than Jews and Muslims in Israel. And it has to be a multi-religious, multi-ethnic state. And it has to have a constitution, which it doesn't have now, that guarantees all these religious rights. And we have a constitution that guarantees rights. We have our Bill of Rights. And those, we can argue about whether they're respected now, and with what's happened with the NSA and Snowden and all of that. But at least we have them written down somewhere, and we have a form of justice that has to respond to those constitutional protections that we have. In Israel, they don't have anything like that. So they need to have a system in place that guarantees that Muslims will have their rights respected, Jews will have their rights, because Jews will not always be a majority in Israel. They are a majority now, but they won't always be. So there will come a time, if there is this one-state solution, where the Jews will need to have their rights protected, because they won't be able to guarantee that they'll have the political power to, legislate on their own or advocate for their own, interests. So that's why every religious group in Israel needs those rights guaranteed. Most Israelis and most Jews think that a one-state solution is the death of Israel. And I don't see it that way at all. That doesn't mean that I think that the one-state solution is the only solution to this, but the worse things get, the more likely it becomes. So was there somebody who's had their hand up that I haven't called on for a while? I haven't called on you.
One thing I wanted to ask.
And then I'll call you next. Sorry.
Just recently, the Swedish government voted to recognize the Palestinians, and I think the United Kingdom has done the same thing. It looks like because of the Gaza thing that there are a number of nations that are starting to do this now. How do you think this is going to progress, and how is it going to impact the whole situation?
Well, like what I said about BDS, it's kind of a gathering storm. First, one country, the UK took a vote in Parliament that was not binding, but that by an overwhelming majority, they said that we're in favor of the principle of a Palestinian state. Sweden, was it Sweden or Norway? I can't remember. Sweden said that they would recognize the Palestinian state. They didn't say exactly when they would do it, but they will do it. in principle, they've put down their marker and said, we're going to do this. I think it's going to happen. I think the EU countries eventually are all going to line up. I've heard that Spain is somewhere in line to consider this kind of decision as well. And I think it's going to become it's going to have a momentum of its own. It's going to have this kind of centrifugal force, like a snowball rolling downhill. And I think that's what happened in South Africa. I think it started with activists supporting sanctions and boycott, and that had a negative impact on the South African economy, and maybe even more so, it just made South Africa into a pariah state. Now, Israel already is, in its sense, a pariah state, but a lot more negative things and damage to their reputation could happen. And that's why I think BDS is going to lead to leading corporations, multinational corporations are going to pull out of relationships into Israel and commerce with Israel. I think it's already happening in agriculture. EU countries are now labeling produce from settlements, and people don't want to buy it. So, and it's hurting the bottom line for the West Bank farmers. That's going to be multiplied, I think. It's going to take a while for this kind of snowball effect to really be felt. But I think, nations are going to eventually be lining up to recognize Palestine. And then I hope it's going to become almost an immutable force that the world will just have to recognize that it would be insane not to acknowledge that we've got all this consensus happening now to do this, and eventually it will have to happen. Look, the Berlin Wall fell. Who would have thought 12 months before, 18 months before, the Berlin Wall would have fallen? And lots of things happen like that. They last for 50, 60, 70 years, and then all of a sudden they don't make any sense anymore because the world has changed. I'm hoping that's what's going to happen. Yes?
First of all, a compliment on a very provocative but also informative presentation. But I have a question. Right now it's obvious that Israel is strongly supported by the United States, meaning the Jewish lobby and the Christian conservatives. That is such a powerful force that it looks like nobody will be able to touch it, but that we agree that that balance could change, say once Iran has the atomic bomb and all the oil, Israel is surrounded by hostile countries where this balance might change, where we may not be able to maintain or support Israel.
Well, my vision about what's going to happen in Iran is a little different than yours. I don't think it's ever going to admit that even if it does have the capacity to make a bomb, it's never going to put it together unless it feels existentially threatened. I mean, Israel has 200 nuclear weapons. Certain countries like Japan have the capacity to make a nuclear weapon very quickly if they need it, and I think that's the route that Iran is going to go, if things proceed. I mean, we may have an agreement in a couple of months or less that by which Iran agrees not to pursue a nuclear weapon and gets other things in return. So I'm hoping for that to happen. Now, in terms of the Israel lobby, God, that's like the $64,000 question. Will it stay as strong and as kind of immutable as it's been, or will it deteriorate? I think over time it will become less powerful. I think over time other voices in the Jewish community will become alternatives. I don't think it's going to happen quickly. I think the lobby is just incredibly powerful. And that's why I don't think that America, as you said before, I don't think America can do this alone. I don't think we should do it alone, and we shouldn't do this unilaterally. But even if we wanted to do it unilaterally, the lobby would stop us from doing it. So I think that that's why we have to have some kind of international consensus before this will actually happen. I had a lot of hope. I never got to talk about the Arab Spring, but somebody did raise a question about Arab dictators. I had hoped that there would be massive change in the Middle East with the Arab Spring. I had hoped that democracy and tolerance and values like that would triumph. I had hoped that Egypt would turn into a democracy and the Muslim Brotherhood would govern Egypt more wisely than they did. There's been a reaction against the Arab Spring. The dictators and the authoritarian figures and the generals have taken back power in a lot of these places. So my hope is that the Middle East will become gradually, it's not going to happen by a revolution like during the Arab Spring, but my hope is that gradually countries will move towards democracy. It's what happened in Latin America. I mean, I grew up in the 50s and 60s. There were dictators. There were so many dictators in Latin America. If you lined them up, with a bowling ball, you could, knock them all over. And now Latin America is largely democratic. And in 1950 or 1960, you never would have said that that was possible. So I hope that in the Middle East this will happen. And when it does happen, that will help Israel, because I think Israel would realize that the Arabs aren't out to destroy them, that the Arabs may have values in common with Israeli Jews, and I'm hoping that Israel will eventually become integrated into the Middle East instead of being a kind of fortress state, kind of with walls and barriers all around it to protect it from the, like the Chinese Great Wall, which is what Israel has now. They have a wall on the West Bank side. They have a wall on the Egypt side. They're building a wall on the Syrian side. So my hope is that eventually Israel will be a place where it will be open to the outside, and that will create huge opportunities for trade, commerce, culture, development, all sorts of things. We're not there yet, unfortunately. Yes.
Well, it's kind of a simple statement maybe, but because I'm older, I start to minimalize certain things. And I'm Dutch. I grew up with the knowledge of Anne Frank. And it's come to me that trust has a lot to do with suffering. And ultimately, we have to realize that everyone suffers. And the question is, what do we do with our suffering?
Yeah.
So that is where the trust comes in.
Yeah, that's a wise question. And I think that that's one that I've been grappling with relating to Israel, because there's no doubt that Jews have suffered enormous amounts in history. We're not just talking about the Holocaust. You can talk about the Spanish Inquisition. You can talk about the Crusades. You could talk about the Romans and the massacres and what happened in the conquest of Jerusalem. So huge levels of suffering have informed the kind of psyche of Jews. And I'm grappling with, okay, so what are we going to do? What are we going to make out of this suffering? Are we going to be traumatized forever as Jews and say that the world has done us nothing but wrong and we'll never trust the world? Or are we going to say, we're willing to take a risk? We're willing to, we're willing to be skeptical, but we're willing to put enough trust in the outside world that we will gain something by accepting either the intervention of the outside world or a compromise with the Arab states or with the Palestinians. That is not yet where the Israeli Jews are. I think there are Israeli Jews who are there, but I think they're unfortunately a minority. It takes a lot of foresight, I think, or forward thinking to be able to surmount all of that suffering and say, I understand my history as a Jew, but I'm not going to let it block me, monopolize my psyche. I'm not going to be enslaved by it. And I don't think that they're there yet, unfortunately.
You have a good point there, if I may follow up on that point. I spent 3 years in the Vietnamese concentration camp, and one way or the other, I'm not sure why, when I finally survived the barely, I made it a point not to develop a grudge against the Japanese, because I felt if you develop that trust, I just destroyed myself. The Japanese were just laughing about being another victim.
Yeah.
So that helped me, but it's not always easy for everybody to do that.
Yeah. I mean, you look at survivors like Jerzy Kosinski and Primo Levi, they committed suicide. And they lived for decades after the Holocaust, and still they carried this burden with them that was, that ended up, it's a psychic burden that was too much to bear. So, I always try to be tread very carefully and cautiously when I talk about the Holocaust, because I wasn't a survivor, and my parents weren't survivors, and the only relatives of mine that were in the Holocaust I never knew. So I did have some great uncle who perished after leaving the United States. But it's very difficult, and it's difficult for non-Jews to be able to talk about these issues too, because you feel like I can't tread on your suffering is so unique that, what right do I have? And that's, in a sense, what some Israeli leaders do. They take advantage of that, and they say, how dare you tell us to take this risk because you don't understand the suffering that we've been through. And there is a certain level of truth to it, but if you use it as blackmail to say the world doesn't have any right to tell us what to do, that's where it goes too far. So maybe if you're willing to take one more question, or we can, yeah.
If I may, I'd like to comment. I think that everyone's suffering needs to be honored, and every person needs to be honored for their own history. I have a simple question, I think, and then a more complex one. I'd like your opinion. On the media, one was led to believe that Israel went to war with Gaza because of the tunnels. And I wanted your opinion on that. And the second thing is, I've heard for decades that if peace came to Israel and Palestine, that this would bring peace to the whole Middle East.
Those are two big questions.
I actually think those are two good questions to end on.
Yeah. Yeah, if I can. And if anybody has any questions that are really important, you can come up afterwards and ask.
You mentioned the Amy Goodman show with Noam Chomsky.
Online you can find, and at Democracy Now! You can find Noam Chomsky's speech to the United Nations, which he delivered 2 days ago, I think. And I haven't heard it, but I've heard from many people, highly recommended, and it's very critical of U.S. policy towards Israel and Palestine. So let's talk about tunnels for a little bit. Personally, I think tunnels are a red herring. Gaza is besieged. It's been since 2006. For a while, there were tunnels that would go into Egypt, and they could bring in supplies because Israel refused to allow much into Gaza, including, for a while they weren't allowing much food in, they weren't allowing anything in, essentially. So they got stuff through tunnels. They were getting meat. They were getting, everything that you needed. Then when the junta took over in Egypt, they closed the tunnels, most of them, and then it became much worse. And also Iran cut off its support of Hamas because it's complicated, but Hamas decided to stop supporting Assad in Syria, and Iran supports Assad. So Iran said, you can forget the $20 or $50 million that we give you every year. And it became very difficult in Gaza, and those tunnels became very critical because that was their only means of getting in and out. So what Israel has said is the tunnels became terror tunnels because Hamas used them to import weapons, and then the weapons were being used to fire at Israel. Well, you might be able to argue that the tunnels were threatening to Israel if the tunnels went into Israel, or they tried to, use them to get into Israel. They did once or twice. There were some operations that went into kibbutzim on the southern border of Israel, and there were a few Israelis that were injured and killed by those kinds of attacks. Largely the tunnels are in Gaza, and largely the tunnels are defensive means for Hamas to defend Gaza. So the idea that a tunnel, for example, if I had to dig a tunnel in Seattle, is, and and the United States is at war with Canada. Is Canada going to say that that tunnel that I'm digging in in Seattle is somehow a threat to Canada? I mean, that's essentially what you have as this situation, because Hamas didn't use the tunnels to launch rockets against Israel. They used the tunnels to send soldiers from one place to another so that they could pop their heads up and attack in one place, go back down, come into another place, pop their heads up. And it was a guerrilla war. That's what a guerrilla war is. So Israel does not have the concept that Gaza is a sovereign place, or that the West Bank is a sovereign place, or that any Arab state is a sovereign place. Israel is willing to intervene in any country, anywhere that it sees as a threat, whether it's Lebanon or Syria or Jordan or Egypt, or Iran, for that matter. There isn't even a border with Iran, and Israel is sending agents into Iran to assassinate nuclear scientists and blow up military facilities. So the problem with Israel is it doesn't have a sense of respecting borders and sovereignty, and it doesn't even have a recognized border, a border that it recognizes as its own border. So these are, major problems that we have to face. And there was a second part of your question.
If there were peace between Palestine and Israel, would this bring peace to the entire Middle East?
Okay, I wouldn't put it. So the question for the camera was, would a peace between Israel and Palestinians bring peace to the Middle East? I don't think I would go that far, but I do see the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as being a major source of irritation and ferment that causes a lot of conflict and fuels Islamist insurgencies like Al-Qaeda or ISIS. The fact that Israel is doing what it's doing to the Muslim holy places in Jerusalem, and the fact that Israel is killing Muslims in Gaza and West Bank and places like this is a major irritant to Muslims all over the world, not just in the Middle East. So in that sense, if there was stability and peace in Israel and Palestine, it would eliminate a major source of friction and anger and resentment. It wouldn't mean that the other places would all of a sudden, in Bahrain, the Shiites and the Sunnis would all of a sudden say, we want to be brothers. But it would really take a major irritant out of the conflict and can only be to the good. Well, everybody, thank you very much. And thank you even for the fireworks.